Welcome everyone to this week's Dornsife Dialogue. I am sure I'm not the only one here who is guilty of having watched every single episode of Homeland. And from the safety of my cozy house here in Los Angeles, I will admit that I always kind of wanted to be Carrie Mathison. You don't have to be a physicist to recognize that being a secret agent is just simply way cooler than your job. So I was surprised to find out that a real life version of that intrepid terrorist hunting spy is actually one of our own alums. So we just had to get her here to tell us her story. So we are honored to be joined today by that alumna, our own Tracy Walder. Tracy had planned to become a high school teacher when she came to USC Dornsife. And as I understand it, she graduated with a major in history and ended up teaching high school just like she planned. Only after taking a detour in between to hunt down and interrogate terrorists in a number of undisclosed locations overseas. In her book, The Unexpected Spy, she tells this remarkable story, and I can't wait to hear it because I have not read the book. Tracy is joined in conversation today with Peter Mancall, our Divisional Dean for the Humanities. Professor Mancall also got a degree in history and is now a celebrated historian. To my knowledge, at least, he has never taken a detour to fight terrorists, but he does know books. He's written 5 of his own and over 40 book reviews, and he has recently read Tracy's book. So he is here to talk with her about it. Thank you both for joining us, and I will turn it over to Professor Mancall.
Thanks, Amber. Tracy, I'm so delighted to have this chance to speak with you today. I just so enjoyed The Unexpected Spy. I mean, it's just it's a great read. I mean, it's great that you come out of Dornsife, out of the history department. So I thought what we could do is just sort of get started here by just sort of talking about, your life growing up in California, and then we'll talk about SC a bit, and then we'll get into sort of the meat of your book. So why don't you tell us sort of just briefly, about your upbringing and what led you to USC in the first place?
Sure. Dean Miller and Peter, thank you so much for having me. And I'm really excited to be here. USC is a huge part of my life and contributed very much to who I was and who I am now. So I'm just very excited to be here with you. So thank you. So I was born in Van Nuys, the Valley. I was a Valley girl. My father actually went to USC and my aunt went to USC. So the Trojan blood runs thick in our family. And really ever since I can remember, I was watching the Rose Bowl or watching USC football games or going to USC football games. So to be completely honest, I'm not too sure that there was another school that I wanted to go to other than USC. I loved everything about it. Growing up, my parents really instilled a love of travel in us. I was extremely fortunate. Instead of presents for things, we got trips and trips sort of around the world and around the US. So I think I was bit by the travel kind of world bug really early. And my father always sort of had a hobby in loving history. It was always giving me Civil War books to read or Revolutionary War books to read. And, I'd always enjoyed history. And growing up, I had a really influential history teacher who made history sort of come alive for me, I guess. And I just decided that I wanted to be as inspirational as he was to me. I spent a lot of time being bullied in high school and middle school and elementary school and just not treated very well. And I think part of me wanted to teach history, particularly at the high school level, so that I could kind of ensure too that what happened to me, didn't happen to future students. So I went to USC and decided to major in history, and I had incredible professors. I took quite a few Chinese history classes and also sort of pre and post antebellum history classes as well in the departments there. And I graduated and went straight into the CIA.
I mean, it's an amazing story. I think, in fact, we have a picture of your graduation from SC, and I think which we're going to pop up for a little bit. Hey, Tracy, can you tell us more about sort of your life at SC? In the book you mentioned quite often, or many times, you're a member of a sorority. You would talk about, sort of riding around campus on a pink bike. Can you tell us a little bit about your undergraduate days, and then we'll sort of transition to talk more about the the substance of the book.
Sure. You know, my undergraduate days, one of the reasons I picked USC, quite frankly, is because it had this really wonderful mix of academics, but also, you know, I really wanted the sports teams. I wanted sort of that camaraderie kind of experience. And I would say I indulged in both. I got a lot out of the academic side, but I also got a lot out of Greek life as well. I was vice president in my sorority, extremely involved in it. I was in the Greek honor societies, and I think it's called something else now, but I was a pepster when I was there, which was part of the Alumni Association. I think it's has a number now attached to it, but I did that as well. And I really enjoyed kind of every aspect of it. And really my recruitment at the CIA is really because of a sorority sister. We were riding our bikes down Truesdale Parkway, which I'm thinking students still do today from our sorority house. And they used to set up kind of career fairs along Truesdale Parkway. And there was a table that said CIA. And I just felt sort of drawn to it. They were looking for history majors. And so I gave them my application.
That's perfect. I mean, I just love the idea that you're pedaling down Truesdale, you know, those job fairs, which are still there, you know, they're incredibly crowded, you know, people on all sides. And
Yeah.
I'm sure that you were one of those more careful students who didn't like run over the professors, you know, while she was bicycling across campus.
No, I never did that.
Of course not. I know, which is great. And I'm sure everyone listening is also in that group of safe bicycle riders, so it's all good. So you left sort of, I mean, I think a lot of people think of SC, you know, we think of the beautiful campus that we all enjoy so much, as really being worlds away from your next, what you did next. So talk to us a little bit about the transition from being a Trojan to being a spy.
And, you know, as Dean Miller had said, I really did want to be a high school history teacher. That was sort of my goal. But I think as I was exposed to different folks within my sorority house or friends that I had met outside of my major, I started to wonder, are there other things that I could use my history degree to do, you know, law, museums, you know, those kinds of things. And I actually started interning at a museum nearby. And I started looking at different ways that I could apply my degree. And because I knew right at that moment, I didn't want to just go straight into teaching. And so for me, a pivotal moment was I was sitting in the Delta Gamma sorority house at USC, and Peter Bergen was interviewing this guy named Osama bin Laden. So this was 1997-ish. And I started thinking, you know, who is this? And I started wanting to know more and more and more about what the Middle East was. And I think for me, we had to remember the world was a really different place in the late 90s. You know, we didn't have Homeland or Criminal Minds or those kinds of shows in pop culture. I mean, we didn't even have the brand new James Bond, right? So I had no real preconceived notions of really what the CIA did other than sort of Cold War stuff, right? Because that's what I had grown up with. And so for me, when I went to that career fair and saw that they were looking for history majors, I viewed it as, oh, this is the potential another application of my degree. And I thought, well, this will be interesting, see what they are about, see what I could do with them. And sort of that's really what piqued my interest.
That's amazing. Okay, so you put in your application and you go through the interview process, and I'm guessing there was some kind of background check. I certainly hope there was some kind of background check.
Oh, yes.
Make sure you weren't going to be like, you know, some sort of mole, you know, whatever. So you passed through that, and then you're going to the CIA. So you know, in the book, you're really good about sort of talking us through the steps, of, you know, of how you became an agent, you know, in the CIA, but also how you maintained a real sense of yourself. And, you know, in ways that I think may be surprising to people who haven't read the book or people who haven't seen you before. You know, I mean, you talk in the book about, you know, your personal appearance, you know, and sort of essentially finding your, I guess what we would sort of say, your personal space within the CIA. Can you, and I think that you found the CIA a fairly welcoming place for a lot of that. Can you sort of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the CIA was an incredibly welcoming organization. And to be honest with you, I owe a lot of that to my recruiter, who I met that day on Truesdale Parkway, and who kind of shepherded me throughout sort of the whole process. I applied in late part of my junior year, and then it took about 5 months to clear. And I had the conditional offer employment by November of my senior year, actually. So for me, he had always, I had had a lot of doubts, why do they want a history major? I don't have a military background. I didn't have this, prominent athletic prowess. I sort of was, I guess, talking myself down a little bit. And I think he was the one who instilled in me that there are no stereotypes of what should be in this industry. You need to go into it and you need to give it a shot. And I think that's what was so great about the CIA is a lot of times the gender narrative, particularly in, the CIA and the FBI on, I guess, the more operations side, which was what I was in. The gender narrative sometimes skews more male. And I think females think that they're not jobs that they can do and still be feminine. And I guess, my message is that it's okay to be feminine and you can still excel at these jobs. And I think that was really important to me.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was really, I'm reading the book. I am also a huge Homeland fan. And I'm reading the book and I'm sort of thinking of Carrie Mathison and seeing you describe actually some things that the show, also represented, the idea that women have to have a different public appearance in the Middle East than men, that you in the agency were in a minority in terms of your gender, overwhelmingly male, and you tell various stories about being snuck in here and snuck in there. I mean, really amazing things. But reading through it, I mean, there's this very powerful authorial voice, sort of recognizing, cognizant of sort of the gender aspects of it. And I wondered how much of that, how much of that was spoken when you were there, or how much of it was sort of subtext that you were thinking about while you were out there.
I think it depended on where I was, depended on what I was doing. At the agency itself, in the course of my, I guess, day-to-day boring work, I know this might disappoint some folks, but you do work in a cubicle when you're not overseas. I realize that's not sexy, but you do work on a cubicle. So I would say just in the day-to-day, no, it wasn't something that came up on a daily basis. I had a really great boss who didn't care about your gender, or it was all about your abilities. So no, but when I traveled overseas, obviously I was very aware of the gender dynamic depending on where I was, and was always worried about how I would be perceived by other intelligence agencies, by other assets, and by other individuals in those countries.
Well, actually, Tracy, I think we have a picture that demonstrates that you weren't always in a cubicle.
Yes.
So if we can pop that up, I think people will get the sense that, that your life was not sort of as we think of the typical sort of office life.
Yes. So I had just done debriefing there, which is why I was wearing all black. And I think I had my hijab kind of on my head, but not really. And I had on a bulletproof vest there.
Talk to us a little bit about why we're seeing those squares over the faces of the others. Because one of the themes of your book is, what are you, now that you're not there anymore, what are you still allowed to say or to show? I thought that was really a fascinating part of your book. But so can you talk to us about that?
Sure. So my book,
about the sort of culture of secrecy, if that's the right word. Yeah.
Sure.
Please.
When I was there, I was what's called an overt employee, so I could tell people that I worked there. However, when I traveled overseas, I went overseas in a full alias. So when you read my book, there are what you would see are redacted sections. When you leave the agency, you sign a non-disclosure agreement that anything you publish will be vetted by them. So I submitted my book to them. It actually took 5 rewrites to get the redactions down to the place where you see them now. I was very surprised at some of the things that they allowed in the book, and some of the things that they didn't. What I came to find out is that the amount of redactions was mostly because it was giving away too much locational information about where I was. And since technically Tracy was never there, we couldn't give away the locational information. So the reason that those women's faces are blacked out is because one of them is still with the agency, and it's not appropriate at this point to reveal her identity. And the other one does not want her identity revealed as being associated with the agency. So I try to be respectful of that.
I do have sort of question of, historian author talking to a historian author, and that is, I thought it was brilliant, the choice to leave the redacted part in the text.
Oh, thank you.
I thought that was an amazing decision.
Thank you.
Because it really gives you a sense of, I didn't know, I didn't catch on that you'd had to go through 5 versions before you got to the version that we saw. Although that does make a lot of sense now having read the book. But I love the idea that, you're doing it and there's still these things. But I'm just curious, did you have like conversations with your editor, basically, where you said, I want this stuff that in the book, even though there's going to be these series of black lines? What is the editorial discussion of that? That's something that
great question.
You'll not have to deal with.
That's a great question. So for me, it was a very interesting process with my editor. For me, I was coming in on the heels of 2 analysts. I didn't serve on the analyst side, but they've become actually really great friends of mine who had actually had their books denied completely, like not allowed to publish them. And it had taken them almost 2 years, I believe, to sue the agency and gain publication. So for me, when I received the manuscript back, even though it had 4 chapters completely blacked out, I was so happy because they didn't deny it in full, right? And I think we went back and forth with them. I appealed a few of the chapters, and I was happy to keep going. It was actually my editor who decided that they wanted to publish it by that point the way that it was, because what they were worried about is if I submitted it to the CIA again, it opens up the opportunity for them to deny it in full again. So I think at that point they put a time on it and said, you know what, we can read this. This is a intelligible piece of literature. Let's go with this.
Yeah, well, it was a great decision. So kudos to you and your editor for sorting that out. Tracy, without pinning you down on a question you can't answer, you give us chapter titles which give dates. You were out in the field for approximately how long? Can you reveal that?
Right. So for me, it was weird because September 11th happened, sort of a year in, and they stopped what we call 2-year TDYs or, 2-year overseas assignments because they couldn't afford to have people in the counterterrorism center gone for 2 years. So I have to more add up the months, right, that I was in different countries because I was just going all over the place. So I think if we added up all those months, it would be 1.5 years, almost 2 years.
Okay. And you were in the agency then for time beyond that, all the time you were in the US?
Yes, so I was in the agency 4 years. I'd say 2 of it was overseas.
Okay, well, without revealing too many of the plot points in the book, because it's such a good read, I don't want to reveal too much. From the cover, we know that at some point you decided to leave CIA and to basically come home, or at least come back to the United States, and made what to a lot of people who are not in this intelligence world seem like the logical choice. I'll go to the FBI, right? Just make a certain amount of sense. But I think that transition maybe wasn't as smooth as you had hoped. Is that a fair way of putting it?
That's correct. So for me, I left the agency actually on really, really good terms. I won a lot of awards when I was there. Some of my best friends are there still. I was in a really good position, right? And so it's hard to leave something when you're in a good position. But strangely, at age 25, 26, I had this foresight that I knew that for the rest of my life, I couldn't maintain traveling to different places pretty much every month or every other month. It just wasn't something that I felt that I could do anymore. And I knew that, that's the core of what the agency does. My parents always taught me, don't leave because you have a bad manager or bad, leave because there's just something about the job that's never going to change. And that was what, it's never going to change. So I thought, well, I'm very passionate about the counterterrorism mission. So why don't I do that where I know I'll stay in one place stateside? And so I felt that the FBI, becoming a special agent there, would be the most logical step at that point. Obviously, it was a completely different environment. And it's funny, I've tried to do research to find women who have served as operatives at the CIA and at the FBI, and I haven't found any yet, but I know that there are some out there. But it's an unusual move to make, I get that. But I didn't realize that there was such a difference in the intelligence community and the law enforcement community. That was naive on my point.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about you talked about the CIA being very welcoming.
Mm-hmm.
And you say that in the book, and really sort of, and I guess, and this is sort of counterintuitive, because not everyone would think, especially after watching Homeland, I wouldn't think, oh, the CIA, that's a welcoming, warm and fuzzy place to go. I'm thinking might be a pretty tough place to work, and especially being out in the field, those conditions are pretty challenging. But through the book, you retain a pretty optimistic tone when you're talking about the CIA. Tone changes a bit when you get to the FBI. And I think it starts from your introduction to the FBI, to the training. And I wondered if you just wanted to talk about that, sort of the different cultures of the two institutions.
Sure. It's funny. I really debated, actually, I guess, an editorial discussion. I really debated putting the FBI stuff in my book. It was a hard decision to make, but it was the right decision to make because, it's my lived experience. I'm sure not everyone had a positive experience at the CIA either. So, I'm sure it's all over the place. But for me, what had happened is I had come from an environment, obviously, that was welcoming, and that really, if you were the right person that was talented enough to do this job, you were doing it. It didn't matter who you were. But what had happened to me was on basically day one of the FBI was just endemic sexism and harassment. To the point that I probably should have just quit the academy, but I'm not a quitter, and so I graduated from Quantico. But it was really interesting because I've reflected a lot on sort of why that happened, and I think that for me, it started really at the top with my class supervisor, almost encouraging it. There is a little animosity between the CIA and the FBI. When I was at CIA, I didn't experience it as much because I was in a center with FBI agents, and so we got along just fine. But what I didn't realize was that he started spreading a rumor that I had never worked at the CIA, which I always found fascinating because they had to come to CIA to conduct my background investigation, which was crazy. They would constantly, if there was a really tough arrest scenario to do, they always put me to do it. They would try to set me up for failure constantly. And what's fascinating is my entire training, my entire time at Quantico was actually videotaped. And I've watched them since then, and you can hear the harassing that they're doing to me behind the video. It's painful to listen to, but it was interesting.
Wow, that is amazing. Hey, since we're talking about the less pleasant aspects of some of your still young career, thinking back across the agency and then into the bureau, can you think of moments that were sort of particularly harrowing, particularly scary, memorable? I mean, you've had a lot of experiences. You tell a lot of really amazing stories in the book. But were those moments where there's sort of, that sort of soul-checking moment? I mean, did you have, I know you had some of those because you talk about the book, but do you want to talk about one or two of those?
Yeah. So, when you're in your 20s, I think you feel a little invincible. So I think I did that soul checking a little later on in life, about them. So for me, a couple definitely would have been when I was there's a chapter in my book called The Vault, which was it still is classified, very highly classified program that I was one of the first people to work on. And I would say the night that we lost bin Laden in the mountains of Tora Bora was obviously a really profound experience, because since I was on duty, I think you feel a sense of failure, a little bit. I think also debriefing terrorists was quite the eye-opening experience.
I mean, you want to talk about that a little bit? I mean, I don't think I think it's going to drive more people to read the book because the details are in the book. But do you want to talk about that a little bit? I mean, that is kind of, it was, you render this in a very sensitive way in the book. I mean, it's obviously a very difficult room to be in, and you handled it with incredible professional skill. Do you want to talk about it a little bit? I mean, it's got, it gets a lot of popular press. Maybe you can clarify some perceptions about what it was like to be an actual agent in a room with an actual terrorist suspect.
It definitely was surreal. I think, you have to look, I know enhanced interrogation is, a big topic, whatever. I don't support it, but I think we have to look at the purpose of it. The purpose of it was just simply to get these folks to be compliant, right? It wasn't to get information out of them. I came in to get information out of them, not to make them compliant. So I sort of I'm not absolving myself of responsibility, but I just want to sort of separate the two and what I did. And so my job was to get imminent threat information from them in a quick and effective manner. And so for me, what that entailed was very quick rapport building, and not rapport in the sense that I want to be their best friend. I obviously don't feel badly for the situation that they're in, but you have to try to either be a good listener and find some common ground. I think that's one way that females sometimes fare better than males in those types of jobs. Not that we're better, we're just different. And I think my listening skills and my ability to read people real quickly helped me in that. I would find out, what were their favorite foods, what were their favorite fruits, what were their favorite things to talk about. And I would arrange discussions about those, or arrange for them to get that orange that they really wanted, or that package of M&Ms that they really wanted. And it establishes a very quick rapport with them, so I can start diving into questions and get honest answers from them. It was an interesting experience. I had one that told me, I'm Jewish. I'm not deeply religious, but I'm Jewish. And I had one, I asked him just a very basic question. Why do you hate Americans so much? I mean, don't most people kind of want to know the answer to that? And it wasn't that. He said to me, no, I really just hate the Jews. And I was like, do I tell you now or later that I'm Jewish? But I would say the most profound discussion that I ever had with a terrorist is I actually asked him, why did you get into terrorism? That was an eye-opening moment for me. And for him, it was because the state or country that he lived in didn't provide him the things that he needed. He was destitute. His parents had abandoned him. He had hepatitis. He didn't know how to read. He didn't know how to write, and he was starving. And so Al-Qaeda came in and said, hey, we'll send you to school, we'll feed you, and we'll teach you English and Arabic. And I didn't understand. It's not something I would ever get into, but it was kind of an eye-opening moment for me to realize the station in life that he had been in prior to joining Al-Qaeda.
Well, I think that sort of actually reveals one of the things that I really found among the most rewarding in the book, which is that, the book reads on one level as you telling this amazing story. But, when you read carefully into the book, you're also very adept at sort of picking up the psychological undertones, and you did in a way I found very impressive, in that you very much, you never sort of went into politics, politics with a capital P. You met a lot of prominent people, you mentioned them in the book, but you never sort of, you never take a cheap shot at anybody in the book. And you're much more inclined to read their characters, and it comes off, in a very sort of straightforward prose, but it has these various levels. So that's just a compliment.
That was really actually important to me.
So following from that, my question now is, because I got to know, did studying history help shape the way that you looked at the experiences you were having, like that undergraduate history experience with us? I mean, how can you look back and say, yeah, by doing X, I can see Y. I mean, do you see a connection there?
If you want me to be perfectly honest with you, I think history is really one of the only reasons that I was decent at what I did. History is what exposed me to want to learn about something that I was either unsure about, confused about, didn't know anything about. And, you know, I think for me, history is political, but not with a capital P, right? You know, it's objectively looking at things. And I will never forget you have to submit a writing sample when you join the CIA or when you apply. And I remember what I submitted was a history paper, and I took a risk. And the risk I took was I picked a paper on why a communist style of government worked for a country like China. I remember my dad thinking, why did you do that? Like the CIA, like, why would you do that? But they said to me that way of thinking in a full 360-degree view from a historic perspective is exactly what they wanted. I took my personal preference, you know, I have personal government styles that I prefer over others, but I was able to separate that from just the facts of historically what China had gone through. And they kept coming back to that essay, and so I actually really credit my study of history with being able to do that.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so let's stick on history for a minute, because we've talked about, you know, SC, going into the agency, going into the bureau, but then you left the bureau and you sort of went full circle back to your original plan, which was become a history teacher.
Yes.
You know, which was just wonderful to see. And you can tell us about that. I mean, that has to be some pretty interesting transition. I mean, first you're biking down Truesdale, and then you're in the CIA. 9/11 happens. You're back and forth to the Middle East. You do that for some time. Then you go to Quantico. You deal with all of the things that you dealt with there, which you write so beautifully about in the book. You go back to California to go out into the field, you know, for the bureau, and then you decide, enough of that, I want to go back. So let's talk about that. So sort of the last part of the book, it's just so inspiring, the last part of the book. You know, I mean, as a man, obviously, I can't go, you know, be your student in an all-girls school. But I mean, your relationship with these girls is really remarkable. So can you tell us about that transition? Because I found at the end that you sort of then bring that life experience into the classroom, which I thought was fascinating.
So I first started actually teaching at the public high school that I went to. I'm from Irvine, California, so I'm from Orange County. And I actually went back and started teaching there. I taught, you know, AP history mostly. And I found that there was this tremendous interest in what I used to do. But the interesting thing was a lot of parents felt that I was embellishing. They didn't believe that I worked the places that I did, which was, it was crazy to me, but I understand now, you know, where that was coming from. And I started to realize just in the curriculum that there wasn't a lot out there that wasn't focusing on Western Europe. And I was becoming slightly frustrated with that, because obviously there's more to history than just Western Europe. And most of my time was spent in Africa and the Middle East. And so once I moved, I left California and I moved to Texas, I started teaching at an all-girls private school. And at the school, you have a little bit more autonomy in terms of the classes. I still kept teaching AP courses, but I realized that these girls didn't have any exposure to the Middle East and Africa and foreign policy and diplomacy. And so I created a course on terrorism, foreign policy, and national security. And it was really one of the first of its kind at the high school level. And as a result of that, you know, these girls were making policy. We were putting policy papers together for our congressmen on bioterror threats, and you know, sending it to them. And it was super rewarding. I recently gave a talk at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. in February. And over 40 of my students, former students, came, and now they're at the FBI, they're at the CIA, they're working at the Department of Homeland Security, all those types of agencies. And I think I started realizing that this is a great way that I can apply what I did. We women are significantly underrepresented in these careers. And it's not that they're better and it's not that men are bad. We just need even representation because their voice needs to be heard. And I think when women don't see the women leaders in these careers, they don't feel that it's a career that they can pursue. And so I kind of, I guess, created my own little farm at my school of women to go into these careers.
Okay. Wow. I can see that we're getting a lot of questions from other Dornsife alums. So I'm going to pose some of them for them, and then let's see where the conversation goes. So if you're watching this live, the window is still open for you to add questions. So the first question I'm seeing here comes from a veteran who mentioned that they were a member of the Joint Task Force SWORD and Joint Task Force 11. And this veteran is asked, are you familiar with those units? I'm not, so are you?
I am not, but thank you for your service.
All right, let's move on to the next question. I think this one crossed my mind also, I have to say, reading the book. One of our viewers is asking, what kinds of language skills did you have before you went into the program? And what did you pick up, I guess? What kind of training did you get in terms of languages for communications?
So that's a great question, and I do get that question quite a bit. So we have to remember that this was pre-9/11 when I first started at the CIA, and that really wasn't the Middle East, and it's hard for us to imagine now, but the Middle East was really not people's focus. It was really people wanted to work in the Russia branch or the counter-narcotics branch. And so they really weren't looking for like language qualified. We didn't have people that we would need to be talking to. NSA transcribed and translated all of our phone conversations. So there wasn't like that need necessarily. But what another thing, there's a wonderful book out there called The Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright. And he really takes a deep dive into Al-Qaeda, and what you can come to realize by that book is that the vast majority of terrorists are actually educated here in the United States. All of the masterminds of September 11th were educated here in the United States. And they all spoke English, and I did not need a translator. Where I would need to bring a translator actually was usually if I was going to prison to talk to a very low level, I guess you could say a suicide bomber that didn't succeed, kind of a low level person. Then I would need to bring a translator with me. At that time, you know, everything was so new. We did not have the time to be sending people to language schools. And I mean, they were starting to recruit folks that spoke Arabic, but again, this was in its infancy. And so we were using sort of translators that we already had. But, you know, when you talk to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or some of the big perpetrators, you know, they all speak English perfectly, which is disturbing.
That's an amazing observation. We have a question that I'm going to sort of rephrase a little bit. The question is, you know, you went to 4 years at SC, you came through, you know, this very exclusive college university. And the question is, would you advise, or how would you recommend, or how would you guide someone who's graduating about going into public service? Did you feel like that was important, like besides the, you know, the sort of what you did? Can you talk to us about your ideas of sort of public service?
So for me, public service has been ingrained in me my whole life. So what I don't write about in my book is that I went to USC for free. My dad's a professor. And so I was part of that tuition exchange program. So for me, you know, my situation was a little different than some folks. And so my dad was a professor, but he was also a researcher for the VA hospital for veterans. My dad served in Vietnam. Both of my grandpas served in World War II. And then I have great-great-grandparents that served in the Crimean War. So I think for me, public service pretty much runs in my family. And it was never any doubt that that was, I don't want to say expected of me, because certainly my parents would have been mad at me, but it was definitely really one of the only career paths that I forged. But I think just from a financial perspective, you know, public service isn't always the most lucrative careers. And I understand that. But I was very lucky in the sense that I didn't have college debts that I had to repay. So I was able to sort of follow that path.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is difficult. I mean, I think we live in an age where, college debt has become a big national discussion. And I think a lot of us who are teaching students I would have been thrilled to have you in class, Tracy, but people, do want to encourage people to think about, public service, but it is hard. But I think your book shows sort of, the honor of public service, that you're doing it, you're not doing it. It's not a fast track to a great wealth. It's a different, you make different choices depending on values. And I think I would speak for all Dornsife professors and say we hope that we help shape those values, sort of thinking of what's important. So I think public service, I think that's.
I remember my best friend and I at the agency, we had come back from a very risky war zone. And she and I were sitting on the floor of my apartment and we just started crying because we were saying, I'm probably not encouraging people by saying this, but we were just thinking we could have been killed right where we were. But yet we couldn't afford to go to a movie that we really wanted to see, and just being really frustrated, that we couldn't do that. And, I think it's a normal thing that people would think about. And no, I did not get into it to become a millionaire. However, I feel completely fulfilled in the careers that I chose.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we have a question, actually, someone would like, we're wondering if you can walk us through the actual steps. So for example, when you go to the CIA, do you start as a sort of an intern, or do you go through an office job and then into the field? I think people listening want to know, what are the actual steps that you went through as your career developed?
So are they looking at more career development, or are they looking at what I had to go through to clear the whole background process?
I think more sort of your career. I mean, once you clear the background, to get in, I think the spirit of the question is more, sort of, can you walk us just a little bit step by step what it was like? I mean, you graduate college in your early 20s, and then you go off and train. So I think it's just a question of, what are the stages? What are the tests along the way? There's physical training as well as various counterintelligence training. I think just sort of, can you talk us a little about the stages?
So my training was a little bit, it's not fair necessarily because September 11th happened. So it changed a lot of what the traditional stuff was. So at the CIA, part of the problem is when I explain this, I'm working with whatever pop culture has put into people's minds, right, about the whole process. So when you apply, and again, things may have changed, right, since I've been there, but you don't get to say, this is where I want to work. That's not how it goes. For me, about 2 weeks before I did what's called EOD, or entering on duty, you receive tasking of where you're going to go. It's really not up for a discussion. And so I was placed in a place called the Counterterrorism Center, which, to be completely honest with you, was not a place a lot of people wanted to be, which I know is weird given our current. But, back in 2000, it just wasn't the place to be. So that's where I was placed. And I was told that I was going to be in the Directorate of Operations, which is where I guess the spies live, and that I was going to be something called a Staff Operations Officer. So I thought, okay, great. You do go to the farm, but prior to going to the farm, you actually don't go straight there. You actually have to sit in your office and work, which I think frustrates a lot of people, particularly the people that really want to get out there because you're like, what am I doing at a desk? But, you have to wait your turn, which is a little different than the FBI. The FBI, you go straight into Quantico and then into your office. So it's kind of the reverse. But the problem is just before I was supposed to go to the farm, September 11th happened. And when you go to the farm, you're there for 5 months. And so the Counterterrorism Center was like, we are not sending you away for 5 months. We need people. And so my training took place piecemeal. So I would go for 3 weeks and I would have, and I think I have it in my book, my Crash and Bang chapter, which is where I learned my defensive driving and surveillance techniques. And then I would also do counterintelligence and dead drop techniques, but we wouldn't do it at the farm. We would do it someplace else that was a little bit closer. And then I had small arms instruction. So it was supposed to take place in 5 months, but it ended up taking place sort of in this piecemeal way. The CIA actually does not have a physical fitness component to it unless you're in sort of their special ops that's mostly ex-military folks. I wasn't in that. The FBI does have a pretty rigorous physical component, which
you describe that in the book. Yeah.
Yes, and which myself, born with somewhat of a disability, I was very surprised and proud of myself for passing those.
You actually, you talk in the book about the, sort of taps into a question that someone asked, which is about relieving stress. I mean, in the book, sometimes it seems that some of the biggest stress was when you were in the FBI training, and you talked about sort of running. Yep. And which we're in this moment where we are now, where we're all in our houses, but and everything is telling us we have to get out and do things. I found that very logical. I mean, I was actually a runner in high school. I sort of know that sense that comes over, but I thought that was really amazing how that worked for you at the FBI, because I was struck, because in the beginning of the book you do tell us about some issues that you had, physical issues you had as a baby, basically. So I thought that was just really sort of encouraging. So do you still run, actually?
Yeah, so working out is my probably biggest stress reliever. It has been really ever since I was like 21 or 22. I started running with my sorority sisters actually at USC. We'd all go running together. So that's when that really started. But I realized I was good at distance running. So I still run, but unfortunately I've had 5 back surgeries and a knee surgery. So I have to be careful, but I do. I'm not supposed to do it, but I still do.
I have a very specific question for one of the alums. Can you explain the difference? Reading the question, between an analyst and an operations officer within the CIA?
Yeah, sure. And that's an interesting thing is for sometimes what I will get from folks in terms of questions is like, oh, well, the analysts must be less than because they're not the spies. And actually, the thing is, I was severely underqualified to be an analyst. Analysts are the ones that have, PhDs in South Korean politics, those kinds of things. They're the ones writing the research and the policy. So that's the role of an analyst. It's actually extremely important role, and it's on the same level as the operations side. So the operations side, which is the side I was on, they're more of, I guess, jacks of all trades, I guess, and they're more the folks that are going out there and collecting human intelligence. They're collecting information on other countries. Perhaps an analyst will say, I really want to understand who South Korea might vote for in this next election. And then an operations officer would go find assets, perhaps, in the South Korean government, task them to get that information and send it back to the analyst. So I think both jobs are equally as important, but that's sort of the main difference between the two. Hopefully that helped.
I think that's a great clarifying question. We have a question here that sort of, I think, wants you to go into a little more depth, if you're willing, about what the questioner is asking, is phrasing as the harassment and negative work environment at the FBI.
Sure.
Did you see, that the person asked, did you see changes while you were there? I know you weren't there for a very long time, but you were there for some time. Did you see any changes? Were there any response to, when you said earlier in this interview that was all filmed, the training, I'm like, wow. I hope that the people who treated you poorly watch these videos. But I'm just curious. I think the question is really about the culture within the FBI, especially for women.
Sure. So what I have found, and this is actually why I included it in my book, is that it has not changed. About 2 years ago, I was reached out to by some incredible women, and 17 of them have launched a gender discrimination lawsuit against the FBI and the way that they were treated at Quantico. So to answer that person's question, obviously I'm not at the FBI anymore, but based on that large lawsuit that is still weaving its way through the courts, that's very recent. Clearly it hasn't changed, and it's why I felt it was important to put that in the book. For me, I did file a complaint when I left the FBI. I should have probably pursued it more. I think part of the problem was that I was really young, and when you're harassed or sexually harassed, part of you feels like it's your fault and you did something wrong. And I became very ashamed, with myself. And so I think in a weird way, I just wanted it to die and sort of go away. I would like to say things have changed. I don't feel that they have. And that's based on that lawsuit that I know is weaving its way through the courts right now.
Well, that's really sort of telling about sort of the culture, and it's really telling that, you were put in that position, even though you had been, out in the field doing, counterintelligence work. I mean, it just sounded, I mean, not to get into this, but I mean, I think it's good that you're involved in what's going on, the continuing discussion. Someone asked a question, which I'm going to read to you because it is my job, but I'm looking for your answer here. And that question is, can you get into the CIA or FBI if you do a major other than history? Now, of course, knowing that being a history major is perfect for everything, it's still a great question. I assume the answer is yes, but I think maybe the way to think about this is, did you get a sense of what other people you were with studied as undergraduates? Yeah,
all over the place. I mean, I would love to say history, that's it, but that would be a lie. Gosh, I'm just trying to think of my immediate friends. I had one that was like public policy and health. I did have one that was Korean studies. I had one that was an English major, one that was a journalism major, one that was actually biology. I mean, all over the place.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Well, I have a fairly pointed question from an alum, which I'm just going to read, and I think it's a good question. That this person writes, do you have any insights into Islamophobia and anti-Arab prejudice in the United States and how we might respond to it?
Yeah, and to be perfectly honest, that's an excellent question, something I feel very passionately about, and I know I'm not able to make that big of a difference, but one of the things that I do, and I actually just added this to my course that I teach, it really bothers me that particularly in America, we feel that terrorism comes from overseas. Terrorism comes from everywhere. It's homegrown as well. And I just added a unit in my class on actually domestic terrorism because I started to realize, my students don't know what Oklahoma City was or what Waco was. And they need to know because they don't have any knowledge of a pre-sort of 9/11 world. And I'm also going to be teaching a course on this actually at Texas Christian University next semester as well, and then at another school here as well. So hopefully I'm doing my little part of showing that, I have no tolerance for Islamophobia. And I think part of it is sort of the narrative that we're showing, even in the media. A lot of times when I have to say I've never seen Homeland. I'm sorry. A lot of times when I watch these shows, terrorists are shown as, folks from over there. And I think that's a huge problem. And I would like to see that narrative change, particularly in the media and pop culture.
Okay. We have a current student who's watching who asks a great question. This is someone who is very interested in operational positions in the agency. And the student writes, how should one tailor an application? What aspects of yourself or your skill set should you highlight in the application?
So it's hard to talk about what to highlight. I can more tell you what to probably not highlight. So, the CIA has sort of certain criteria that are what we say no-goes, meaning if you served in the Peace Corps, you can't go into the agency until you've been out of it for a certain amount of time. So that would be something that people would want to consider because that's more the issue. I'm not saying the Peace Corps is bad. It's a wonderful organization. That's not the problem. The CIA views that as perhaps you will become empathetic to that country and perhaps it might become a security problem. And so that's something a lot of people get really zealous and are like, I lived for 5 years in North Korea, or well, that's actually going to be a no-go. for the CIA. And so it's kind of actually those things that you might not want to highlight if you have traveled to some perhaps questionable areas. Not that there's something wrong with them. The CIA just deems them as intelligence risks per se. So I would say that's something that you would want to play down.
Okay, well, I think that's very good practical advice. Hey, Tracy, if it's okay with you, we have a lot of questions coming in. Can we go about another 15 minutes?
Sure, my daughter's really enjoying watching movies right now, so we're gonna.
Okay, so for those of you who are still watching live, we've got a lot of questions. Feel free to keep them coming, and we'll go about another 15, and then we'll see where it goes. Okay, I'm gonna just sort of, I hope to get through a lot of their questions. I mean, obviously you struck this chord here, touched the nerve, which is great. So one of the watchers is asking, what advice do you typically give in your high school to your high school students who want to work in intelligence? And I know from the book that there's at least, you talk about one girl in the class, but I mean, what advice do you give them?
So what I give them in terms of intelligence is to cast a wide net in terms of the intelligence opportunities that you're applying for. Because what can happen is kind of the same thing with history. I was trying to cast a wide net of different applications that I could have of it. It's the same thing with intelligence. The CIA is not the only manufacturer, collector, of intelligence. There's lots of agencies that do that. And so that's what I try to tell my students, because, let's say they apply for the CIA and they don't get in. Then they're like, well, now what do? I guess I have to look at something completely different. And you don't. There's the Defense Intelligence Agency. There's the State Department. There are so many other intelligence gathering organizations that you could utilize those skills with. Okay.
But do you, when you're, I mean, these are, these young women, I mean, do you sort of say, here are the courses you might want to think about in college that might prepare you for this? Or I mean, do you give them that sort of, I know that people, when I was going to college a while ago, I would talk to my high school teachers, who were dedicated, like you're obviously dedicated, and they would say, I might try X, Y, or Z. Did you give them that sort of kind of advice?
So for some of them I do, and for some of them I don't. It depends on the student. I try to walk a really careful line. I don't want to push my views or tell a student sort of what to do. Sometimes what will happen is it's less about what courses to take with at least with my students, and more about what colleges to go to if they want this. So for example, I had a student who actually did not get into USC, but she was trying to decide between two other schools. And I said, well, if this is what you really want to do, she wanted to go into intelligence, this is the better school for you with the better programs. So I would say that's more the, mentoring that I provide with that. And now she's there and she's interning at the CIA, so she did fine.
I'm going to combine a couple of these questions, which I think are relating to each other. And one of them is, did you ever have moments where you feared for your life? And then related to that, how much while you're doing things did you tell your family?
So one thing I'm very appreciative to my parents of is that they let me do this with no pushback. So with my family, they knew that I was working at the agency, but unfortunately when I traveled overseas, they couldn't know where I was. And I obviously had a different name, so that was difficult. So one of my friends, who is my best friend still today, was the person that I had designated almost to be my next of kin if I was overseas. And so one of the things that she did was that she was responsible for, sort of updating my parents, if you will. I would email her almost kind of like daily updates, hey, I'm okay. You can tell my parents that I'm okay. And then I would do the same for her when she was overseas as well. So in a weird way, your kind of colleagues and friends become your family.
Yeah. Did you have moments where you're thinking, whoa, this could really go badly? What am I doing here? I mean, are you allowed to talk about that, or do you want to talk about that? Or
so one of them, we were getting ready to land in a war zone, and there was a full firefight going on the airfield, and we were actually starting to run out of fuel. And we had to make the decision to land in the middle of an active firefight. And we actually didn't have bulletproof vests for some strange reason on the plane. I really don't remember why. And so we had to run into these SUVs that still had bullet holes in them, and go to where we needed to go. And then another time, the car that I was in was accidentally shot at by a friendly fire because they mistook us for someone else.
It was a bulletproof car, I hope.
Yes.
That's good to know. Well, the next question is really in some ways the perfect Los Angeles question. It's from an alum who wants to know if you have an update or any information about a TV series based on the book.
So I have no information for you right now. Unfortunately, things are sort of, I guess, dark given the whole pandemic issue. It's been pretty steady, pretty good.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just trying to think. Some of these are going through some of the same questions again. Do you think, someone asks, is there an optimal time to join the CIA? Would this be something that's best out of college? Would it be best later on? I mean, I know that in the book, when you talk about the FBI, a lot of the people going into the FBI seem to have other careers first,
Right.
Whether lawyers or law enforcement,
Absolutely.
whatever, and then they go into the FBI. This is a question specifically about the CIA.
So with the FBI,
moments?
you can't join the FBI until you've had a couple years of relevant work experience. So everyone there has had you can't join the FBI. You can't become a special agent right out of college. It's not one of their qualifications. So for the CIA, in my opinion, the best time to do it is when you're as young as possible, because it is not a conducive environment to having children and a family, just because it's so constant. It's a difficult environment to have a full family. And so I would recommend that folks do it when they're younger versus older.
That actually plays into one of the questions. You mentioned that when you were out in the field, you had a different name. Mm-hmm. Did you go through training to sort of suggest, how to act differently from Tracy? I mean, did you take on certain traits to further mask your identity or to further your mission? Was there that training?
So unfortunately, I actually can't answer that question because it's tradecraft and they won't let us go into that.
I'm sure that everyone understands that. The next question, there may be a similar into two. Although I'm hoping you can do a little more here. One asks very sort of pointedly, what was the farm like? Can you talk about that? Is that?
It seems to be,
well, that's the question. I mean, I think it's a question, what was it like living there? What was it like working there?
I can't go into too many specifics, obviously. The farm was great. It was so different than the FBI Academy just because there was such a sense of camaraderie, at least for me, there was a sense of camaraderie there. And I viewed my instructors like truly as mentors. They were there. They wanted you to succeed and they wanted to be your cheerleader and they were willing to work with you afterwards if you had questions. And it was such a different environment than the FBI Academy, which was such a beatdown. The farm was, it wasn't, the living conditions weren't exactly the best. I could hear like rats on my ceiling at night. It wasn't nice. It's not the Ritz-Carlton, but it was fine.
Fair enough. Here's a sort of a more substantive kind of question. And I'm going to read this so I don't misstate get it wrong. The viewer asks that you mentioned, you served as both an intelligence and a law enforcement officer. Which approach do you believe is best for countering terrorism, the CIA's or the FBI's? And do you see drawbacks in either one of them?
That is such a good question. So I personally think the CIA is better equipped. However, I think the FBI could be just as well equipped if they valued their analysts as much as the CIA values their analysts. At the FBI, special agent, that's what's viewed as sort of the top, right? And then analysts are kind of viewed as underneath, which is really disturbing because I view them as just as important. At the CIA, everyone's sort of viewed as this equal, and I think that's why they do such a good job. you have to remember that the goal of the FBI is to enforce the law. There's not a whole lot of wiggle room in there. And I think, the CIA sort of has the ability to think outside the box a little bit. And when it comes to terrorism, it's just not that simple.
Here's a question from someone who I think is, if I'm reading right, soon to graduate from SC. And it's a question that I think is a tough question. It's for any of us to answer, but I think it's a very pointed question. Person writes, would you recommend that soon-to-be graduates of SC with interest in international relations pursue opportunities in the CIA, even if these soon-to-be grads have political views that are dramatically different from those of the current president or administration?
100%. And let me tell you why. So I worked there under two different administrations. So I worked there under Clinton and I worked there under Bush. And I think the greatest gift the agency ever gave me was the ability to see things apolitically. And so, I have views and opinions about things, but in my views are very much grounded in facts that I've gathered, instead of people just assuming that must be a political fact. And so our leaders in charge will change. Sometimes sooner, sometimes later. They will change, but your career at the CIA can last decades, right? And so I think I have a lot of friends who are still there who I know, I'll be very frank, do not support the current administration. And that really isn't seeming to have a tremendous impact on them. I worked with Gina Haspel, who's the current head of the CIA. I worked with her, and she's a very apolitical person. So I can't imagine it having that tremendous of an effect. So I would tell that person to go for it.
Okay, I think that's a great question. A question that came up, when you wrote the book, and we talked a little bit, and you talk in the book about the CIA vetting the book. Did the FBI also have to vet the book? Did they have the ability to redact information as well?
Yeah, at the FBI's was very easy, actually, because CNN, the case that I worked at the CIA, at the FBI, had already been on CNN and had already been written about in the New Yorker and had already been brought to trial, prosecuted, and the guy's in jail. So I got very lucky in that it's not an open case anymore.
Right. Yeah, no, you were quite open in that, and quite open about the work that you did there, which I think, safe to say, not the most glamorous work.
Well, but dumpster diving was very fun. I
shouldn't have offered that judgment. You're right.
I enjoyed it.
Well, what I thought was so interesting there, Tracy, was when you said something which I think, whether you intended to or not, is the perfect kind of thing which you want someone with training as a historian to do. You said when you're there sorting through trash, if you went in looking for something specific, you wouldn't have found it. But if you go in with an open eye, then you can see what's there. And that seems like such a simple insight. But in fact, that's actually hugely important for how we do any kind of research, certainly historical research. If you go there looking for something specific, yeah, you might find evidence of it, but you might also miss all the other things that are going on there. You might miss, you might find the signal, but there's so much in the noise that could really change the pattern. So, do you want to talk about that a little bit? I thought that was were you trained that way? Did someone say, don't look for the specifics, look at the larger pattern? How do you do this searching in some sense?
No one trained me in that. I think I just, I've always had an open mind, I guess. No one really trained me in that. That's a great thought, but I've never been trained in that.
Okay. Somebody asks, one of the observers writes, asking you, as a historian with a pretty unique level of firsthand access, what do you look back on as the most significant changes over the last 2 decades? Things that I'm finishing the question here, things that we might be too close or too outside to observe as civilians. You have access that none of us, or almost none of us have. What do you think has evolved over the last 2 decades? How do you see things, I think? And if that's too political, if you want to steer away from that. I'm just curious, I think it's a question about, has your training and access changed the way you look at the world and changed the way you look at the last 20 years?
100%. And I'll be very open with my politics that I don't really hold too much back. For me, I grew up in a wildly liberal household, in Southern California, and there's nothing wrong with that. I just was. But what I have to say is I had a lot of thoughts and opinions about things. And what I learned is that it's not black and white, these thoughts and opinions. And working at the CIA and having access to that information tremendously shaped my ability to have a much more informed opinion, and has quite frankly sort of made me very apolitical in how I approach situations. And I think a big problem, at least right now, is that intelligence is being politicized. And that's when I worked there under the two different political administrations, it wasn't. And that's what was so great about doing that, was I was able to see things through a Democrat lens and able to see things through a Republican lens. And I realized that a lot of my opinions and thoughts that I thought were true were not. And that was a very eye-opening experience for me.
I think that's a perfect, bipartisan note to sort of end on in our age of hyper-partisanship. I mean, I think it's really important. And I want to take this opportunity to thank you for sitting through and answering so many of my questions and our alums' questions and our current students' questions. And I want to thank everyone who has sat and watched it. And I can say, and here's a plug, the book is really great. And I hope that many of our alums and students will read it, because it is just a terrific read. Tracy, congratulations on the book. I look forward someday to meeting you in person, socially distanced perhaps, but nonetheless to actually meeting you in person, because I really felt I got to know you a bit by reading the book and more in this conversation today. So thank you for sharing your time with Dornsife. It's really been a wonderful experience.
Thank you so much for having me, and for all the amazing questions, and for everyone who's watching, for all of your questions. I really appreciate them.